of what mastering is. No hands. It's obviously a massive subject, and it's hard to kind of boil it down into, yeah.
Like the step between making something from just like a project like you have like from your DAW or whatever into something that sounds professional.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. A lot of people say it's turning a project into a product, so you can sell it, and that's one way of looking at it. But it makes it sound possibly a bit sort of commercial. But yeah, you're right. It's taking the idea and making it, presenting it in the best possible way. But I think in its most simple form, mastering is doing nothing. So ideally, that's why I'm here, is because I shouldn't be mastering work. It should be mixed to the standard, at the best possible standard, so that I don't have to do anything. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, but you know, I think good mixing saves a lot of time, saves everyone a lot of time. And by explaining what I'm doing at the mastering stage, I can help you to understand what I have to do, so that you can hopefully mix better, and use the tips that I give. Hopefully, might help you if you're mastering stuff yourself, because a lot of people do that as well. Yeah, and also mastering is a compromise. That's another good quote, because anything that I do is ultimately a compromise, because you're compromising the integrity of the music by touching it, you know, changing it in some way, because it's the artistic vision of somebody else, and you're taking it and changing it, and you don't have the right to do that necessarily. So you've got to be very transparent if you can. But there's different ways of looking at it as well. That's one way. You know, mastering is a compromise. It's got to be pure and pristine, and then, you know, then on the other end of the spectrum, there's mastering should be proactive, and it should change the sound and make it sound better, so that when you get your master back, you think, wow, you know, rather than confirming what you've done, it's taking it to another level. And then, you know, some people usually want somewhere in between those two things, where they want a bit of input, but they want to know what they're doing is roughly right. So on a practical basis, you've got things like EQing, dynamics, and loudness. Those are kind of fairly basic things which shouldn't necessarily affect the quality of the sound. It's just tweaking the quality that it already has. And then there's other things like effects like reverb. Some people use reverb, I never use it. And there's spatial processing and other things, you know, harmonic excitement. These are things which add to the sound and change it in a more almost artistic way. So I do a bit of that, but I try to keep that to a minimum as well. Yeah, the other thing I thought I'd point out is it's not necessarily about the gear that you have. That doesn't make that doesn't make a good master. It's how you use the gear that you have got, and your working method when you're preparing a master is more important than any of the tools necessarily. You could chuck, you know, thousands of pounds at you know, a vintage EQ or something, and it will give your sound a certain sound. But if you don't use it right, it's worthless anyway, you know. So yeah, I guess the question we should be asking is not what is mastering, but how do you do mastering? You know, how is it done? That's kind of more important, really. So if you're interested in learning more about it, there's a book by Bob Katz, who you probably know about, called Mastering the Art and the Science, I think it's called. His 3rd edition is coming out soon, so you might want to hold on until it comes out. And it's full of loads of really good stuff. And also Gear Sluts is a really good resource for finding out information about equipment, but also about technique. And that's probably more interesting is the technique, because, you know, the equipment is, a lot of the time, it's really inaccessibly expensive, I find. And yeah, and I went on there because I'm sort of just recently been really kind of getting into A/Bing stuff and listening to your dry mix and your wet mix and comparing the two and how to do that properly. And I went on to Gear Sluts, which is the thread, you know, that's about this, and they said there's ways of doing it. You know, you can kind of route things around the mixer and trim things down and change things so that you can do a comparison between the two, but there's no dedicated solution to it. So I thought, I think that's a fundamental principle of mastering, and there should be a tool to do it. So I got together with a software developer recently, and we came up with this plugin, but it's obviously very basic. It's called Montaigne, and it's for mastering, but it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't change the sound in any way. It just helps you to compare the sound before and after you've done any processing on it. So you could use it whilst you're mixing, and you could have a mix that you've finished and put that on a separate track, and then feed your new mix through and your old mix and compare the two to see if your new mix is any better. Or you could use it for comparing two tracks to get an instant comparison between the two. But I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. So yeah, I want to talk a bit about the signal chain when you're mastering. And we're going to be looking today at this plugin called Ozone, which a lot of people will probably be familiar with. We're using it because it's got everything that I need to explain all in one place, and it's quite affordable, and it's pretty good quality, and it's got some really good, unique features which I think are really good. So we're going to start off with this bit here, which is the graph. And this is really useful because this helps to explain the signal chain that you're using. And I have a similar signal chain in the studio, so I have an EQ and the dynamics. I've got one valve compressor and then one software compressor, and I use a sort of harmonic exciter as well, and I use a matrix for stereo imaging. But this part of it, it's good to just know this little bit of it because it helps you to order the chain. So if you wanted to put dynamics in a different place, you can just move it to there and it'll change the order. I think that's, as it is, it's pretty good anyway. The default settings spot on really, but it's worth knowing about so you can change it if you want to. So the next bit I want to go on to is the loudness maximizer. So if you press the red button, that just means that you bring up the window with all the details in there. And then if you click that button, it means that it's active. So it's actually doing some work. And what we're going to do is send some music through here. Just going to turn the amplifier off so I can go through there as well. So this bit here, this toggles between A and B. So what I'm going to do now is toggle between A, toggle between B, and then you can hear the difference. This is A. This is B. So, did you notice a difference between the tracks? Not much. Put your hands up who thought A sounded better and who thought B sounded better. So nobody thought B sounded better. Actually, the only difference between those two tracks is that one is 3 dB louder. That's the only difference. And I did that to demonstrate that actually when you're listening to something, it makes masses of difference. Someone said it sounded warmer. That's quite possible because being louder, you might be picking up more of the harmonics in the track. So you can fool yourself easily into thinking it sounds better just because it's 3 dB louder.
Is that being limited or compressed to be? Is that extra 3 dB? Is that kind of cool? Why it sounds up in mix?
No, it won't have, because I've also lowered the master by like 4 dB. So when I'm working, I lower the master down, so I've got a nice range to work in. Because say the track comes in and it's already peaking at 0 dB, then I bring the master down and then.
So you've got more headroom to work with.
So you've got more headroom, yeah. And then once you can go to bounce it down, you bring the master back up to 0.
So should we be doing that sort of when we do our final mix down before we move on to mastering? Should we be leaving ourselves some dB in the headroom, or should we be trying to get it as loud as we can for our mix down and then master it?
Yeah, I recommend whenever you're working, turn everything up as high as it will go, but not in your mix. I mean the monitors.
Yeah.
So turn the monitors all up, but be careful because if you play like the latest Beyonce tune in iTunes through it will blow your speakers up. But really, what you should be doing is bringing everything down in the mixer, and having the monitors high, so that gives you massive dynamic range to play with. So then all of a sudden you'll turn all the faders down because everything will be too high. And then, I mean, the mixer's going to have, 32-bit of dynamic range to work in. You could work in the bottom 16-bit or the top 16-bit or the middle 16-bit, it wouldn't make any difference. So you might as well work in the middle or bottom 16-bit. So
when I send tunes to actually be masters, I'll do one bounce where there shouldn't be limited for me to play out, and then I'll do another bounce where I've done nothing to it, because in my opinion the limiting and the compression should be done by the guy who knows what he's doing. So I'll leave one tune really quiet, there's no clipping or anything, so when I send something to master, if I send something to you, I'll have one version for me that's loud for the clubs and one version I send to you that you kind of bring up to that level.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. I mean, I'd rather have two versions. People say, which version do you want, wet or dry? And I just say, just send both. You know, it's easy these days. We've got the internet. Data's not a problem. Just send it. But then there's also the other side of the coin, the whole chicken and the egg thing. If you're producing and you're mixing and you're vibing off the sound, you might want that sound, to be compressed. And so part of the creative process is compression. So there's a difference between compression for effect and compression for loudness, and basically compression for loudness should be avoided until the last stage, and limiting as well. You shouldn't really limit for loudness, ironically, but I'll go on to that a bit later as well. Okay, so that was just a little test. So then what I do is I use a different limiter, but for example on this one, say you could bring the master down, bring it down to minus 12 dB, and then that's a good working volume. So now you've got loads of room to play with. So you can use this. I start off with a limiter, although it's the last thing in the signal chain. I usually start off with this, so I calibrate my mastering situation, and then use the limiter to bring the track up to a competitive loudness, so it's like a working level. And it's not really, you can see that the limiter's kicking in ever so slightly, but you can see that this bit here is a really interesting feature of Ozone. It shows you what bit is where the loudness lies. So at the moment you can see it lies sort of 16 decibels below zero. And you've got these little peaks, which will be the peaks in the transients, and this is what your limiter should be doing, is just, you shouldn't notice what it's doing, it should be transparent, so that it's just lopping off the inaudible little peaks, and that's it. You shouldn't be ramming the sound up against that to try and get it as loud as possible. You should look at other ways to get the loudness, I think.
Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the loudness maximizer in iZotope Ozone. First of all, we're going to look at where it sits on the graph here. We can see that the loudness maximizer is here, just after the EQ and everything else that's processing the audio, and just before the spectrum analyzer and the phase meter. That's because it's there to essentially prevent any clipping on the output. So we have it on the end of everything, do all our processing, and then have the loudness maximizer as the last thing in the signal chain. And I guess the very last thing in the loudness maximizer is the margin here. So if we set that to minus 0.2, that means there won't be any samples going over minus 0.2 dB, and that's a good idea just to act as a safety buffer to help prevent any clipping. You can also use the prevent inter-sample clipping option there, which will stop any sound that goes higher than your designated level. It can happen sometimes if it's between two samples. It might be a bit higher than those samples. So if you click that option, it will prevent that from causing any unwanted clipping. Next, we're going to look at this window here, which gives us a kind of visual readout of the intensity of the signal over time. And it gives us a good indication of the dynamic range, or of the dynamics of the music. And we can see that it's sort of going up and down quite a bit there, and there's a lot of space at the top here which isn't really being occupied that much, so we know we can perhaps bring the loudness up a bit without affecting the dynamics too much. So say if we bring it threshold down by about 4 dB, something like that, you can see that whenever the signal goes above minus 4 dB, the gain reduction here starts to kick in. But there's also a makeup gain, so as I brought that threshold down by 4 dB, it also made up that loss in gain, so it kind of pushed the signal higher up and actually gave us 4 dB more loudness. So that's why it's called the loudness maximizer, because it helps to get rid of any unwanted dynamic range above the signal, thus maximizing the loudness. So that's the loudness maximizer included in isotope ozone.
So I start doing that to get it to a level where I feel comfortable working. I mean, it might be a bit quiet or loud or whatever, but yeah, we can bring it up. So then if we go back in and compare it to A again, you might find that you need to trim the dry source up to your wet source, so you can constantly compare between the two, and there shouldn't be too much difference. So as you're working, you can tweak the level of the dry and the wet signal so they're the same. So you're always doing an equal comparison, which is fair to both versions. Because if one is louder than the other, it's unfair on the other one in a sense. So I try and keep it fair in a way. So yeah, then there's the other section here, the parametric EQ. On this track, I'll just skip forward to the preset that I saved called Digital Labz, because I just thought, I don't know, the mix to me sounded like I took a little dip there because there was a harsh sound every now and then, that kind of metallic sort of industrial sound. I thought that sounded a little bit too harsh and would bring the overall level down. And the sub was quite heavy, and generally this kind of range here was going to... So in a sense, when you're trying to master to get the level up, you have to sometimes... The things that stick out most are the things that you have to deal with first, because that's what's going to limit you in terms of loudness.
Okay, so now we're going to have a close-up look at the EQ section in isotope ozone. So we activate it as usual with this button here. So it's a parametric EQ, although it doesn't look like it is. But instead of having 3 control knobs for each band, it's got just a point on a graph. So you just move this point around. So up and down is how much it's going up and down in dB, and you can see down here that I've just taken it down by minus 3.3 dB. And obviously the frequency, you can move it left and right, and you can see the frequency change here. And to alter the Q, you just bring these little brackets in and out. And I really like that way of working, because you can kind of you just forget about all the buttons and you just drag things around, and instead of having to go down the bottom and look at different parameters down here, you can just drag it around. And I really like this Q adjusting thing here. So when you work with several different points, you can see which each one is doing really easily. And the other thing I like about this EQ is that it's got the mid-side processing built in. So at the moment it's processing the stereo signal, so it's having the same effect on left and right at the same time. But if, for example, I wanted to do some mid-side EQing with this EQ, I could select mid-side up at the top here, and then it gives me 2 different windows. The red window is the mid signal, and the blue window is the side signal. So if, for example, I had a problem with some bass being too wide, I could take the side signal EQ and effectively center it by bringing the EQ down. I don't know, something like from 100 hertz upwards. I could have it on a quite a gentle slope going up like that, and then the mid EQ I could use for my general EQing. So that's a really nice way of doing mid-side EQing without having to set up a mid-side matrix. The other thing that's quite interesting about this section of the plugin is that it has an EQ matching facility. I wouldn't recommend using it necessarily for trying to make your music sound like somebody else's. I think that's probably not a very wise idea, but it's interesting to look at nevertheless. Say for example you EQ'd something and you bounced it down and then forgot which EQ settings you'd used. You could use the matching facility to measure what EQ settings you'd used and apply those settings again. So I'll show you roughly how that works. So you have to go into the snapshots window and take 2 different snapshots of the frequency spectrum around here. So okay, so we'll take the first snapshot now. All you do is go into the snapshots window and click on A, and then you see that it's taken a snapshot of the sound source. So then you want to imagine that was one of the tracks that you'd measured. So now you wanted to take a snapshot of a different sound source. So you click on that snapshot there. So now you have 2 different sound sources there. If you click on matching, you see that the plot of the EQ has changed, and it's given you the EQ curve that you'd need to use to match the purple one to the yellow one, because in the snapshots here you've got the purple is the source and the yellow is the target. So that's just another interesting feature of the isotope ozone EQ.
So then I thought, well, maybe EQing's not right because there's a lot of stuff in that range which actually sounds quite good. So instead of EQing it, I'm going to put some multiband dynamics on there. And the thing about multiband dynamics is that it's really a fix. You know, it's a substitute for good mixing. So it's a remedy, a patch on what should be done. So I don't tend to use it. I use it occasionally, but I never use like 4 bands or anything like that. But I thought this would be a good way of doing it, because then you could limit that sound, but without affecting the rest of the mix too much. The other interesting thing about the dynamics section in Ozone is if you control and then click, you can remove bands or add bands, which is quite handy. And the other thing is the options here. The attack and release settings, they seem to be missing, so if you just click on that button there, it gives you the attack and release times for everything. But I'll show you a bit more about that later.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about multiband dynamics, and the question I've been asked is why would we use multiband compression, for example, instead of an EQ? Because essentially they perform a similar function. They both alter the tonal balance of a mix, but the difference is that, for example, an EQ alters the tonal balance of the mix in a static way. So if I go in and make an EQ change, for example, that won't necessarily change throughout the piece unless I introduce some automation, which I occasionally do if I think that the EQ settings need to change over time. But I mean, sometimes there are too many changes that I need to make, and I couldn't be entering all of those in and automating that process. So it's sometimes a good idea to use a multi-band compressor like the one included in in Ozone. I don't often find myself using more than 2 bands, so I tend to use a split band compressor, which essentially divides the signal up into 2 distinct bands, and then just processes that one band and leaves the other band alone. But the default setting in Ozone is for 4 bands. The most common use, I guess, for a multi-band compressor is a de-esser. Essentially, a de-esser is like a split band compressor that's acting on the sibilant range of vocals. So it depends on the vocalist, but it could be, you know, anywhere from, I don't know, 4 or 5k, you know, up to sort of 10k, that sort of region around here, that we'd want to be working on. And we'd want to do this because if for example we use just an EQ, it would always be affecting the tonal balance of the piece, whereas if we use a dynamic EQ or multi-band dynamic compressor, we can set it so that it only takes effect when it's needed. So for example, if a vocal had one instance where there was a lot of high frequency content, we could make the dynamic compressor kick in then, and then it would leave the rest of the track alone, essentially, so that if there were other high frequency elements in the track that we wanted to mainly preserve, we could do that. So it's kind of a way of EQing without affecting the entirety of the frequency band that you're working on all the time. So let me give you an example. Let's take this band here. If we decided that this particular range we wanted to sort of treat it occasionally when it got too loud, we could bring in the threshold like this, just to a certain point, so that most of the time it's not working, but then occasionally essentially it EQs that band and brings that EQ down. So yeah, I wouldn't use a multi-band compressor too often, because I think that, you know, the quality of a mix tends to be inversely proportional to the amount of gear that's needed to get it to sound good. So if you have to use a multi-band compressor, it's often because the mix itself isn't too hot.
The other section I wanted to look at was the stereo imaging section, and this is split up into the same bands that you're doing the multi-band compression with, which is a bit annoying, but you know, you can sort of select your bands carefully and work within those bands. So what I've done is I've lowered the bottom end, so I've centered it. So these 3 bands here are as wide as they should be, and then this lower band here has been narrowed to make it good for cutting onto vinyl. So once I've done that, I'll go back into the limiting stage again to see if the changes that I've made have affected the loudness again. So, you know, because EQing and compression, anything that you do to a track will change your perception of the loudness of the track. So you can go back in again and just have a little listen, compare the two. You know, that's sounding a bit quieter now, so I'll turn A down so it matches B. I can't really hear very well, but this is my sort of working method. Okay, so that's just a little kind of a quick process of what I might do on a mastering session using something like Ozone or similar. I mean, in the studio at home, I have it's broken up into individual units, because this is a good all-round solution, but I prefer to use a range of different combinations of stuff and mess around with stuff more, you know, so it's good for starting with, I guess. So what I want to talk about now is is dynamic range as well, and dynamics generally, because it's a thing that a lot of people kind of struggle with. So I want to talk about different areas of dynamics. So what is dynamics? It's basically the loudness of stuff from the very, very quietest sounds to the very, very loudest sounds. And manipulating dynamic range means increasing or reducing that amount. So, like classically, you think of compression and you think of downward compression. That's only one of many types of dynamic processing that you can use. And it's the one that's most overused, and it's the one that leads to the effect that Eveson was talking about of stuff sounding just too much of like a wall of sound. And that's because you're focusing on one particular area of dynamic range. So if I can use the board here. So we've got I don't know, 16 bit of space that, you know, our target format is going to be a CD or an MP3 or you know, vinyl's got less than 16 bit, but you're looking at that, and this is the loudest and that's the quietest. And what we tend to do when we want to make stuff louder is that we reduce the dynamic range and push everything up. So what tends to happen is so that's your actual dynamic range, and you want to go for something like that. So what do? You just lop the top off and then boost everything up and bring it up. So effectively you lose that, but what you've actually lost is that, because you've taken the very loudest bits, chopped those up and moved everything up. But that's not the only way to do it, and that's downward compression, but usually when you downward compress something, you use make-up gain. So you compress it down and then bring it up. But you could also use upward compression, which is compressing the quietest bits upwards without affecting the highest bits. And that's quite difficult to achieve with a compressor. But I'll show you now a good way of doing it. There's also different types of dynamics in terms of the length of time that you're talking about. So you might hear of microdynamics and macrodynamics, and microdynamics are the small characteristic sounds of a certain part of the music, say a kick or something like that. And then there's macrodynamic changes in loudness as well, and that's how the music varies over the longer periods of time. And it's debatable as to whether there's even a difference, but most people will say that you use different compression techniques for shaping individual sounds than you do for shaping the drama of the whole piece of music, in a sense. So like a lot of the time when I'm doing macrodynamic changes, I just do manual gain riding. So that means that, for example, you've got this drop here. If I use some compression, that would compress everything the same. So if I wanted to then just compress the louder bits and not compress the quieter bits, it's hard to do that with just a compressor, so you can do it manually. So you basically just do some automation on the intro, make it quieter, and then when the drop comes in, make it louder, just by raising the gain. And then when it hits the compressor, it'll sound like the beginning hasn't been compressed so much. Alright, cool. So there's also expansion, which is making stuff sound like it has more dynamic range. I mean, there's no actual way to genuinely increase the dynamic range of something. Once it's been recorded, it can't be increased, it can only be decreased, because when you're compressing something, you're taking data away, but when you want to add more data, it doesn't exist, so you have to make it up. So it's an artificial way of increasing dynamic range. So we call that upward expansion, which is, it does the opposite of a compressor. Instead of cropping the tops off, it actually boosts the tops so that the loudest bits sound even louder, and it's a good way of adding impact and energy to sounds. It makes them sound more,
Is that what the you might know, the Oxford inflator? You know, there's the Oxford plug into the compressor. Is that basically what the inflator's doing? Do you know, or?
Yeah, no, the inflator is I think it has harmonic content because it makes it sound fatter. But I think that what you're thinking of is the transient modulator, which if you put that into plus mode, like positive mode, it'll take a snare, that looked like this, and it'll just go and add a little bit more on there. Right. Or if you put it into minus, it'll just crop a bit off the top. So it's a transient modulator because the transient is the change from quiet to loud. So if you're modulating that change, and you're affecting it. So you're increasing the change or decreasing the change. It's a good tool, but it's a bit of a blunt tool because you can apply it and it'll do this roughly the same thing. And it's got settings which you can edit, but you can achieve the same thing using a compressor at the right settings, and then you can be more specific to the music, and you can. Because really the character of dynamics is all in the release, ironically. So how you set your release settings will give the music its character. And you can't really do that with... And then you can be more specific to the music, and you can... Because really the character of dynamics is all in the release, ironically. So how you set your release settings will give the music its character. And you can't really do that with... There's loads of different versions of that kind of software which just kind of they seem to add instant kind of impact and stuff. It's really good, but you have to just sort of switch it on, and then, if it sounds good, it sounds good. If it doesn't, then you can't use it, sort of thing. So then there's also downward expansion, and that is noise removal. So if you remove the noise floor from some music, then you expand the dynamic range. So a lot of the de-crackle, de-hiss, de-noise, de-hum, de-whatever, that's essentially increasing the dynamic range because you're dropping the noise floor. So there's more to dynamics than just compressing. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Gotta find my other notes now. Right, so does anybody do A-Bing in the studio, and if so, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I do. I kind of get the two tracks in two sets, in Cubase, dry and wet, and then you can set it so when you click on one, it just solos that track, and when you click on the other one, it swaps it over. So I do it like that, and then, like you say, sort of test the levels, just to, they say, so you're not kind of one's going to be sound a lot louder, so I sort of try and balance it out that way.
Yeah.
I do that with a copy of my own, so two copies of the same one. I also do that when I compare my tunes to other people's, so I do it the same way. So.
Right, yeah, okay, that's good. I mean, ideally you want to have a situation where it's instantaneous as well, so if you can find, when you can write kind of macros and stuff for Logic and maybe for Cubase as well, where ideally it wants to be like one touch, and so that it's instant, because music can become a memory really quickly. So if it's instantaneous, you can do real-time comparisons and make it trimmable whilst you're doing it real-time as well. But anyway, this plugin will be available soon, so as soon as it is, I'll let James know, and he can send you the link. It's going to be a free download and stuff. So. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is cut the same track again, but using. Oh no! What I'll do is I'll show you a way of. Yeah, that's right. One of the things I've forgotten was. So how do we go about reducing the dynamic range of a tune so that we can make it louder without destroying this essential information? This is the bit that gets lost when we compress stuff. We use a technique called parallel compression, which you might have heard of, and it's becoming more popular these days, and more plugins are including a parallel compression slider so that you can mix mix with a parallel compressor. So I'm going to open up another project which I've just quickly knocked up. So you can do this with any compressor that you choose to use, and it basically turns compression on its head. So the way to do that is, I'll just show you the mixer settings. So I'll bring up Ozone again.
Okay, so now we're going to have a more in-depth look at parallel compression in Logic. So if we open up the mixer, you can see I've got the source audio here, and it's been routed to two separate buses, the wet and the dry, and they're both being mixed together at the output. So on the dry bus, I'm going to put an instance of Ozone again, and we're going to set it up as a single band compressor. By default it comes as 4 bands like that, but really we just want to have a single band compressor for parallel compression. So to get rid of these bands, you have to control click on each band, and there's a drop down menu and you can remove each band at a time, so I'll just do that. Okay, so I've got a single band compressor now, and what I'm going to do is bring the threshold right down to about 50, minus 50, and use a ratio of about 2.5, and an attack time as quick as possible, and a release time about 300. Now these are just approximate settings, you can use whatever you think sounds the best. So at the moment all we can hear is the dry signal, but then if I bring the wet signal in, you should be hearing a little bit of the quieter sounds sounding a bit louder, but you shouldn't hear too much artifact from the compressor coming through, and the transients should still be nicely in place. Now because the wet signal is being processed by Ozone and the dry signal isn't, the signal is actually arriving at the mixer a little bit later than the dry signal, but Logic has a built-in delay compensation feature to make sure that both those signals are mixed in at exactly the same time, so there's no phase difference between the two, and that's really important for doing parallel compression. So I'm just going to show you that and where that is, so you can make sure that that's switched on. So you go into Preferences, into Audio, into General, and then into Plug-in Delay Compensation. And if you select All, then if you mix two signals together, one which is processed and one which isn't, Logic automatically delays the process signal and aligns it with the dry signal. Well, let's imagine for one moment that you were mixing out of the box, for example in an analog mixer, and you had one signal which was slightly more delayed than the other. We're going to simulate that by switching the delay compensation off in Logic. Okay, so now you might be able to hear that there's a slight sort of phasey sound because the two signals are mixed together, but they're not time aligned. So the way to deal with that is to use your own delay compensation. So I'm going to use a sample delay to delay the dry signal so that it's time aligned with the wet signal. But in order to do that, I need to first take the threshold right the way up so that it's not actually acting on the signal at all, but it's still got the same number of samples delay. So it's kind of working on the signal but not having any sound effect. So that means that we can do a null test. So what I'm going to do is put a gain plug in here, invert the signal. So if the two signals were identical and time aligned, they would cancel each other out, but they're not, because the Ozone signal, if you like, is arriving a little bit later. So in order to line them up, we're going to get a delay plugin called sample delay, and we're going to link left and right together, and then we're going to slowly raise it up until it lines up and cancels out the original signal. You can hear the sound changing. and as the signal gets closer and closer, the phase gets higher and higher in frequency. Until at 43 samples, the two signals are perfectly time aligned. So the automatic delay compensation in Logic was doing that for us before, but now that we've got it switched off, we have to do it ourselves, and that's how you do it. So if, for example, it's 44 samples, you can hear the signal coming in again. Or if it's 42 samples, again, you can just about hear the music. So at 43 samples, we know we've got the two signals exactly time aligned because they've cancelled each other out. So we can take the gain plugin off, which was inverting the signal, and we can bring the threshold back down and start processing the signal properly. And that is how you do parallel compression in Logic.
And what I'll do is I'll take away all of the bands, so you've just got one band compressor, and then we can look at what it's doing. So the best way to do parallel compression is really to compress the hell out of something. So that's just normal dry, and then take the threshold right down and have a fairly aggressive ratio. So that basically what you're doing is you've just taken that's a pen. By doing that, you've taken your transient and you've cut the top off it, which is precisely what we don't want to do. But then so what we've kept by doing that is this section here, which is the general RMS value of the sound. So it's got no peak at all. So if you then take that and mix it with the dry signal again, you're essentially mixing a heavily compressed signal with the original signal again. So you're doubling up this RMS here, while at the same time you haven't touched the transient on the original version of the tune. So by mixing them together, you're compressing upwards instead of compressing downwards. So any compressor you like, you can just use that technique, and what should happen then is, if you look at the loudness maximizer, when you take away the parallel compression, you've got a lot of energy along the top and not so much down the bottom. But then if you bring the parallel compression in, you're adding more energy to the quieter sounds, so the quieter sounds are lifted.
Do you not get any phase issues or anything like that when you're doing stuff like this? Or?
Yeah, you do. You have to make sure that I don't know if the latency compensation was working well then. It messed up earlier and it sounded really weird and phasey. So you do have to make sure that that's working. You've got some delay compensation so that it's sample accurate, or you can do it in the analog domain and you don't have to worry about it so much. But you do have to make sure it's obviously synchronized like that. Yeah, definitely. And you could do loads of different other techniques in a parallel, because a lot of effects that you might use are quite blunt and quite obvious. So parallel compression is a way of hiding what you're doing in a sense and making it less obvious. When someone hears their tune, they think, it sounds the same because it's got the same transients in there, but it's got something more. It's almost like the inflator. It's kind of beefed it up without taking away anything from the top end. So yeah, once I've done that, I'll basically do a test cut normally, see how it sounds, and then if it sounds good, I'll cut the whole track, send it off to the client. But if I'm doing a digital master, the final stage is dithering it down, and obviously dither is another thing which everyone's like, what the hell is dither? It doesn't sound good, but it's kind of music for the format, the target format. And you can see all this stuff is, this is the bit rate that we're working at, 24-bit. So that essentially means that we've got 24 switches that are binary switches, and they can either say yes or no. And then you have 24 of those switches, all different combinations of those switches gives you your resolution. So you have a massive resolution with 24-bit. I mean, you have huge with 32-bit, but 24 is massive. But the thing about it is people say, oh, well, 24-bit gives you loads of dynamic range, but that's not the important part of it. The important thing about working in 24-bit is that every single thing that you do whilst you're in 24-bit is calculated with more precision. And that means that it's going to sound better. So if you EQ something at 24-bit and then bounce it down to 16-bit, it'll sound better than EQing it at 16-bit. So that's why we did it at the very, very last stage. It's the last thing we ever do. If you're going to send something out to then be mastered to loads of different formats, you won't dither it, because the person who's going to have to dither it dithers it. And if you don't have to, don't. So if I'm going to cut to vinyl, I won't dither at all. I'll work at 24-bit and keep it like that all the way. And then if someone says, right, I want a CD master, I'll dither it. And Ozone surprisingly has one of the best dither types that there is. Well, people say it's as good as the power dither and stuff. But it's not something I use a lot, because I do more analog mastering, which doesn't need it. But essentially what I'm trying to say is that don't worry about it until the last stage of the mastering process. But be aware of it, because different dithers have different sounds, and they do affect the quality quite a lot. So if you have a rubbish dither, it'll just sound less detailed. But essentially what you should get is a good dither will make it almost transparent, so you won't notice that you've taken 8 bits of depth away. Does that make sense?
To be honest, no.
Well, I think just work at 24-bit and deliver your masters to the mastering house at 24-bit or higher.
Can I just ask something? Say about the dithering, because that's something I was looking at recently. That when I make a track and finish it off, I do like a sort of a quick limited version to send out to people and to play. And someone mentioned dithering. I said, okay, I've never really looked into that before. It's not really essential for that, is it? It's not going to make any difference, is it? If I just do like say I'm creating a 320 MP3.
Yeah.
Would dithering affect it, or not really?
Not really, no. But then once it's been done, you can't replace that depth. So.
Okay. I mean, it doesn't really add any sort of characteristics to the sound or anything like that, does it? It's just like, well, at that stage, I suppose, it's not really essential.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, the noise shaping that you use will affect it, but it's the sort of thing you're not going to hear at MP3 quality.
No.
Definitely not. I mean, it's quite a subtle thing that you can hear if you're really listening. But yeah, I'd say if you're sending demos out to people, it doesn't matter.
No.
But just once you got to the stage where you're going to send it to the mastering engineer, then take any reduction in the bit rate off for the final bounce, and then, because obviously working with 24-bit files, they're huge, so you don't always want to send your mate a 24-bit WAV, But yeah, make sure you can disable, or make sure you're aware of how your workstation works, so that you can disable any dither that there might be in there, because sometimes it's hidden and you can't find it, and you don't realise that you're actually outputting 16-bit when you thought you were working in 24-bit, because it's dithering it all the time. So find out where it is, switch it off, and then when you bounce it, turn it on, I guess. Okay, well, I'm just going to do a cut of that, and then you can hear the results. Hopefully I'll be able to send it through the speaker. So I think I'll take it from the drop. So I'll take it off there. And this is another EQ. This is designed by the guy who I'm developing the software with. And I really recommend this as a all-purpose EQ. It's like £100 or something, which is really, really good value for money. I've got a plugin that I use in the studio which costs about £1,000. It's the Algorithmics PEQ Red, and it's seriously high res and takes up loads of CPU, not the sort of thing you want to use for mixing. But this is pretty amazing because it has 4 different modes. Well, 5 now, like digital plus, minimum phase, analog phase, and linear phase. So if you're mixing, you can use it at digital phase. It's got really low CPU, and then if you want to go for like mastering grade, you can up it to linear phase. And then here you can have like massive filter windows, so that it's really, really high res. So it's basically it can do what all of the top mastering EQs do, and it can be used as a mix EQ as well. So what I'm using this for today is it looks like a really weird curve. It's for cutting to vinyl. So when you cut a record, it's got to be boosted. You've got to boost the top end and cut the low end to be able to fit the music onto the record successfully, and to reduce the surface noise. So I just applied that. I'm going to turn the volume down and turn the amp on. Obviously I haven't got the lathe calibrated properly. It takes a day to get it right, and I've got to have the right mastering environment to make it sound good. But that's just a sort of rough demo of what it sounds like once it's being cut. So, yeah. So has anyone got any questions at all? Because I think we're running out of time, really.
Is there any way you're supposed to prepare a track before you send it off to get mastered?
I'd say it's up to you mainly, because it depends how far you want to go into the process of preparing the master. If you want to be really hands-on, then you can. I think the best thing to do is to communicate with the person who's doing the mastering, and don't be shy about ringing them up and saying where do we go from here, and can you listen to this this mix and this. Can you listen to both? So tell me which you think would be best to work with, because sometimes someone will send me a dry mix and I'll be like, well, I don't really know what they want from this, because I can't tell from them sending a track if they want me to turn it into a really loud master or not. So if you're going to send them a dry mix, which is just really dynamic and open, but you want them to turn it into a really loud master, then make that known and just
So there's nothing that you kind of require as a mastering engineer from a tune. Do you know what I mean? So it's just, yeah.
Well, I'd say just have as high resolution as possible, and just keep the communication open with me, and as much as possible, and tell me as much as you can about yourself, and reference tracks as well. Send them in, or give me links to the reference tracks, because not all mastering is the same, and not all mastering engineers have the same ethos or ideas about how to master stuff. And
can you pretty much master anything? Because I know a lot of people here, we're just sort of starting out. When we finish a tune, I'm going to be thinking about sending it off to master. Is it possible that you could get a tune that's just because obviously we're all learning, we're all making mistakes. So if we send a tune over to you, is it ever possible you won't be able to work with it, or can you pretty much, like, say the bass is riding really high? Have you got ways of sort of controlling that and bringing it through? Or?
Yeah, there's stuff I say that I just don't think. I think you should mix this better. There's stuff which I can't do, which you need to do. This track is not finished, or.
And you're happy to provide that feedback to people. So if they send it over and you're like, look, you really need to go away and look at this and this.
Yeah. It has to be a two-way thing. Mm-hmm. It just can't work otherwise. And some people just say, well, just do whatever you want, and I don't care. And that's fine, but really, if something hasn't been done properly in the mix, there's no way to correct it, so it's got to be done that way. But yeah.
Can I ask a question about noise floor?
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, what I actually do is record. I use a Mackie desk exactly the same as that, and I have channels going into it, and then when I've done my final version, I literally just press record on Cubase, and it records the whole what's going through the decks. What you're saying about noise floor, if I record that say I've got that recording at a really low volume, it's going to have a higher noise floor, isn't it? So the tune's not going to sound as good, or as loud or whatever, than if I recorded it with slightly more gain, or as kind of as optimal as possible, I think, without actually clipping it. Is that right? Is that what noise floor is?
Yeah, exactly. When I'm talking about dynamic range being 32-bit, that's only in the digital domain. When you go to the analog domain, it's different. It depends on the quality of the mixer. is paramount. You know, like good mixers have massive dynamic range because they've got really low noise floor. But nevertheless, no matter how good the noise floor is, people always use compression to get their music above that. So when you know, if you're mixing in the box, you don't have to worry. But if you're mixing in a mixer, then you compressing stuff is going to be all the more important because you can bring it above the noise floor more. But because you can bring the gains up. But the thing about that is, that doesn't matter. What matters is that your piece works coherently, so that, say for example, you have a vocal which hasn't been compressed or de-essed or anything, and then you mix that with a really heavily compressed drum break or something like that. The two aren't going to gel because one's massively dynamic and the other one isn't. And then when you go to the mastering stage, you're going to be trying to treat the vocals, trying to bring the dynamic range within, you know, a reasonable limit. But then, of course, by doing that, you'll also be compressing the drum breaks even more.
Yeah.
So that's the key, is to get the dynamic ranges of each track working with each other. And then you shouldn't need mastering because you won't need to apply any dynamic range, any dynamic processing to it, and you could put a limiter on it, bit of EQing, and then it would be finished. But it's like the biggest problems I have are when I've got a dry vocal in the middle of a heavily processed track, for example, or just one cymbal crash that's just mentally loud, and I have to apply a de-esser, just for that one part of the track where they just could have put that easily in the mix. And we've got tools, we've got an abundance of tools these days, so it makes sense to use them. And the work that Ethan was doing earlier on is sounded really good, but if you're at the stage where you can't, there's so many things to think about. It's good to think about it in two stages, so you get the production stage, get the sound that you want, and then you can break it out into stems. And I also offer a stem mastering service, which is where you can break it up into like 5 or 6 different bits, and then I can have more control over those bits. But you could.
Would you recommend that as a service over an actual full mastering service? Would you recommend stem mastering and then, like, the final master, as it were, over just doing a final master?
Well, I tend to sort of leave it up to the client to decide, and people say, well, stem mastering is a lot more work, and I charge the same for a stem master as I do for a digital master. And I say, well, yeah, it is more work for me, but it makes my job easier because if I had to do that on a stereo mix, if there were things in there that I couldn't solve in the stereo mix, that would be a lot more difficult.
You mentioned price, the same price, like roughly, what are you looking at to get a tune sort of mastered for I think for digital, over sort of vinyl? I mean, sort of what sort of money are you talking about per tune, or? Well,
I charge 30 quid for a full digital master, and that includes a revision, like one revision. So if you're not happy with the first version, then you can come back and ask for more. But I also do a cheaper one, which is just a quick kind of once over, because I came from working for DJ producers where they'd send me a finished tune, I cut it onto dub plate, and in the process I tweak it a bit and make it ready for playing out in a club. So when they play that next to a dub cut by somebody else or a pressing that they've had done, then they're comparable in terms of loudness and overall sound. So I also provide that service where it's not really for a release, it's just for DJs to play stuff out, so it's half the price.
Okay, so it's 15 quid just for us and 30 quid if you want to sort of send it out?
Yeah, if it's going to be released and you want to go into more depth, which is really quite reasonable compared to a lot of the London studios or.
How much would you charge for sort of a sit-in service? So if we came down and sat with you whilst you were doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I welcome attended sessions. It's the same price. I don't draw a distinction. The only thing is obviously I've got really tight itinerary, so I have to go through stuff, and it'll take about an hour to do a master. So yeah, if you want to be there for that hour, then we can arrange to do it. And I quite like it because it gives me even more insight into what you want it to sound like.
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer going to an attended session because you've got an idea of the track in your head, and that's not going to be the same idea that you have. There's going to be elements of the tune that I might really like, and you might be like, well, I need to bring that sort of in a little bit.
Yeah,
so I'd rather sort of do it that way, so you've got that feedback and that communication. And
yeah, because everyone's got an idea, everyone's got a preference over what they like. So I had to be as neutral as I can, but I can't help thinking, oh God, I really don't like that, or oh wow, I really love that. or turn that up more, and that not be what the artist had in mind. So yeah.
And I got one more thing, like obviously anti-phase has been like a subject I think has been badly bound for a couple of people. Obviously, Wedge said earlier, anti-phase, Paul's like, go wild with it. I mean, from a mastering point of view, where do you kind of stand on that kind of thing? Because
what do you mean by anti-phase? Sorry.
Well, it's when your left speaker's doing something completely different to the right. So
okay, yeah.
So I use the Waves plugins quite a lot, and you've got that sort of stereo field, and then you've got this big red kind of do not enter sort of area here. And
yeah.
Like I'm looking at James' tunes when he's making them, and he's got looks like a semicircle across the whole thing.
Yeah.
But then when Wedge was doing it, he was literally keeping it in this sort of area. So I mean, from mastering, where do you stand on it? Is it an issue for you? Is it something that you correct, or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry, I've completely forgot to talk about that. I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and the whole setup that I use is works on the MS principle, which is it's a miking technique, but it's been adopted. The same matrix has been adopted for EQing. So in Ozone, you've got like stereo, which is where you EQ and it does the same to both speakers, and then you've got mid side, which means that the mid will affect both the speakers, both the channels, and then the side will affect the difference between the two channels. And there's lots of stuff that goes on so you've got the difference between the left and right, and you've got what's the same about the left and right, and those are two channels of information that can be manipulated. But not only that, you've got what's different between the left speaker and the mono signal, and what's different between the right speaker and the mono signal. And essentially it's a question of polarity. So you can think of like a cross going through the room, down the middle and across the side. And so you've got 4 distinct areas that you're occupying and that you can effectively treat. And a lot of the time I find that people overdo it. So what they'll do is they'll whack up the difference. So whatever difference there is between left and right, they'll just open that up and exaggerate that. But that is all very well, but it's not necessarily the most effective way of doing it. And I think like stereo, like spatializing has to be done subtly, and it's to do with like timing as well, because you can just do pan pot stereo, which is just pan everything in different directions, which is great, but all that is just amplitude. So all it means is it sounds to your ear louder in one ear than the other, so it gives you the impression that it's coming from a different direction, when it's actually, that's not necessarily true. Right. Because when something comes from a different direction, there's time elements in it as well, so your ear will receive the signal before the other one. Right. And so it's time and amplitude. But you can go overboard with that, but not achieve much. So it's a case of, I guess, it's such a huge subject. I don't know where to start really, but yeah, I think you need to have a way of listening to that as well. So this plugin that we're developing, oddly enough, has got a range of monitoring types. So this is the side signal, which is essentially the left and right channels mixed together, but one of the channels, the polarity of the channel has been reversed. So that gives you the difference between the two. So you can hear how much difference there is. If there's loads of difference, and then you listen to it in stereo, and you're like, that doesn't actually sound that wide, you're processing loads of stereo without making a difference. Whereas if you really notice there's loads of depth to the tune and loads of width, then you know that you're having the desired effect. And sometimes like too much stereo field can be disorientating, and it makes you feel uncomfortable and slightly like you don't know where everything's coming from. And there's real stereo field and kind of synthetic artificial stereo field, because not all recordings are recorded in stereo. It's going to crash again, isn't it? But yeah, well, I've pretty much finished with that anyway. But so if you get a microphone in MS mode and record a real stereo recording in a real room, it will give you the real timing difference between all the instruments and the direction of that as well, because it will be more it'll be louder in one than the other, and that's genuine, and you can really work with that. And then there's artificial spatial enhancers which will take signals and filter certain bits out and then spread them across from channel to channel and ping pong them around and give the impression that you're in a real space when you're not, and that's harder to work with because it's not real in a sense. Yeah, but recording, like working with a live recording that's actually stereo is really enjoyable because you're actually treating a real room. Yeah, I'll just show you the EQ, how that. So if you have a track that's got too much or too little, you can put it into MS mode and then select the side, and then whatever changes you make will affect just the difference between the two channels and not. So you can cut loads of the bass end and centre it and stuff. Any more questions?
Yeah, millions.
What are the things that you hate when you get like something sent to you to master? Are there any things that really get on your nerves? Like if someone sends you something, you find it really hard to kind of master.
Yeah, I think when people send like low res files, it's not always their fault. So I try not to get annoyed, but I think why not send us a WAV, and stuff like that. And broadband's really easy these days. But I guess what I was talking about before about mixing is when it's been mixed, it's not to do with what sounds are being used or the artistic integrity of the tune. That's not my business. It's your tune. You make it how you like. But when it comes to mixing, that there are kind of fairly loose guidelines about what sounds good and what doesn't, and just when easily avoidable problems have arisen, and you think it'd be so easy for you to just de-ess that vocal or EQ that, and also too much processing as well. So when someone's gone too far and they've really gone to town with making sure that each element of the thing has been filtered, and using really heavy filtering and really, really steep slopes on stuff. Because the problem with doing that is that you concentrate all the sound in a very narrow frequency range. So if you get a vocal or something and then just put a really heavy filter on it, the loudness comes from the amplitude, so you have to boost it. If it's got a wider spectrum of sound, then it can be raised less and sound as loud. So when you're heavily filtering, you have to be aware that when you turn that up so it's audible, in terms of amplitude, it's massive. Say a triangle. It's one really, really precise, really, really narrow tone with not much harmonics, and it plays havoc for mastering because it's so narrow. And if you want to treat it, you have to really pick it out and tease it out, and it just needs lowering. And filter sweeps. Often people use filter sweeps for effect, which is great. It's a great effect to use, but if it's too high in the mix, it literally just jumps so high out of the mix because it's so narrow band. So I'd say if you're going to do a filter sweep, widen it, and it has a similar effect, but it makes it more audible, so you can have it lower in the mix, and just stuff like that, I suppose.
I've been told that you have to kind of bring high frequencies down before you send them off to mastering, but how true is that?
Yeah, that is pretty true. Yeah, because it's one of those frequency ranges that goes by unnoticed a lot of the time, because not all monitors can reproduce high frequencies as well as others, and so it's easy for a 20 kilohertz frequency to slip through unnoticed, and it's eating up valuable dynamic range for no reason. So I'm not saying lop it off and filter it out completely, but that air is great. I love air. I love hearing it when it's applied correctly. It sounds great on vocals and stuff, but if it's just there for no reason, then just keep an eye on it. And really, when you're cutting to vinyl, your vinyl cutting engineer should be able to work with anything. So whatever you send them, they should. Vinyl shouldn't be a limitation. Unfortunately, it is, but normally the limitations are fairly kind of in keeping with the human hearing range anyway. So you can't really cut very loud signals at 20k, but you can't really hear them either. So why cut them? And the same with really low frequencies. Anything below 20 hertz, you can't hear. So and it's going to make the needle rumble around like hell and probably make the record skip. And equally, if it's in stereo, the thing about low frequencies in stereo, it's really hard to gain any idea of stereo width at low frequencies. Your ear just can't do it. It's because it's to do with the length of the wave and the distance of your ears apart. But yeah, there comes a point where you can no longer tell where something's coming from. But you get a sense that it's stereo, but you don't know where it's coming from. So keep it, but just keep it in moderation so that you have the sense of space, but not overwhelming. And if it's at 20 hertz, you're not going to hear it, and you won't be able to tell where it's coming from. So just filter it and center it, and you won't notice anyway most of the time.